Thank you so much. Thank you again for being here at the end of the year. I know it's a very busy period. I think Mariela gave a really good comprehensive introduction, and just to repeat, the main purpose of this specific session is to really build a bridge towards a discussion on an in-depth discussion on the practicalities of EU-China collaboration or competition in developing countries. But before that, we want to start with a conversation that looks at the full complexity of EU-China developments. And I think as a foreign affairs think tanks, we often jump a bit towards the discussion on competition in third countries, looking at resources, looking at investment opportunities, clean tech markets, etc. And we often overlook that EU-China cooperation or EU-China dynamics also exist beyond that and are often very important beyond that. And the way the internal or the bilateral relations also very much inform how in third countries EU and China operate. So this is really to try and bridge that perspective and bring that perspective on EU-China clean tech relations independently, and then to try and see how that influences external investment. So for that, we have a brilliant panel or hybrid panel of speakers, starting with Cecilia Trasi, who you see on the screen now. She's a senior policy advisor, industry and trade at ECCO Climate, after recently having made the switch from Bruegel, the Brussels think tank. Right next to me, I have Jesper Friis, who's the head of development policy and partnerships at the Confederation of Danish industry. Then we have Ceren Ergenc, who's a research fellow at CEPS, a major expert on EU-China, but also on EU Global Gateway and external investment. And then online, but you cannot see him yet, we have Manjonjo, who's a just transition advisor at PowerShift Africa. And I'm really glad that I'm finally able to get Kuda to join, even remotely, one of our events. So I want to start with you, Cecilia. And I want to start with a broad question, because you've worked on this from an industrial policy point of view, both at Bruegel and are now looking at this increasingly from a international diplomacy point of view, diplomacy and trade point of view at ECCO Climate. So I want you to help us set the scene a bit. How do you see these EU-China dynamics that Mariela was talking about in the clean tech sector? How do you see that today? How do you see the dynamic, also the balance between competition and convergence? And also, I think we focus on this very often through the lens of US-China tensions. So I want to also ask you to maybe reflect a bit on the EU-China moments that we have to look out for in 2026, and also how you see, or whether you see risk of escalation or opportunities for sort of improving that collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alfonso, and I hope you can all hear me well. Yes, great. Yeah, I saw you with a thumbs up. I'm sorry I cannot join in person. But as said, like health reasons are keeping me here. I said before that the way I would describe EU-China relations, especially when looking at clean tech, they would be paradoxical. Paradoxical because they are marked by three very, contrasting dynamics. On one hand, we have clear interdependence, economic interdependence. Then we have, defensive measures by the EU that have been put in place. And at the same time, also a diplomatic commitment to prioritize climate and climate policy as an area for cooperation. So I'll go into each of those a little bit more in detail. When I say economic interdependence, I refer to exactly what Mariela was saying before. We just cannot, in Europe, do the transition without access to cheap Chinese technology. And in fact, this is also proven by the fact that last year, around 2/3 of all the clean tech that we have imported were coming from China. But even if we were to either, diversify away completely from China or to start manufacturing completely all the technologies we would need, whether that is, for full solar panels to just the turbines to inverters and so on. So regardless, if we were to do it entirely by ourselves, we would still depend on China for critical minerals. I mean, 90% of all, the rare earth processing happens in China. So there is very hard, to imagine a world where we can do without China to achieve even our 2030 target. On the other hand, China depends on access to the European market as well. I mean, despite its great efforts to diversify its export markets, especially towards emerging and developing markets like Brazil, Pakistan, and so on. I mean, it's reaching everywhere. It still depends on high-paying markets like the European one to actually advance to actually keep on expanding its own industry. So this is a fact, and we cannot really shy away from it. But obviously, that raises fears around economic competitiveness and economic security. And this here in this, I come to the second dynamic, which is the more defensive measures taken by the UN, the retaliation or is it the weaponization of critical minerals coming from China. In terms of economic competitiveness, the prime example of this is, are the tariffs. The tariffs were imposed, for example, on most recently on EVs last year. They were introduced in October 2024, and that followed the anti-subsidy investigation by the EU, and that ended up into tariffs that reached up to 45% or a bit more than 45% for selected electric vehicles coming from China. And also calls for a more, let's say, protectionist or policy or closed door approach when it comes to imports of technologies, not only EVs but others from China. In here, I think that there are some, positive signals, as in literally earlier this month, like literally a few days ago, actually, talks have been resumed between the EU and China regarding setting minimum price mechanisms. As in, they would offer a concrete and safer off ramp from tariffs that would potentially keep on escalating. So I do think that is actually a very good signal and something that we can look forward to next year, actually spring next year, 2026. Then in terms of economic security, as was saying before, critical minerals are a resource that China can use to advance, to leverage, its power or advances, towards its own objectives. So in October, and batteries as well, actually, but in October 2025, so just a few months ago, China introduced export controls on some lithium batteries. And processing technologies, and as well controls and limitations on exports of rare earths. That was meant as a reiteration of a policy that was introduced also already in April. That is meant specifically to address the US, really. But the EU and specifically European industry was caught a little bit in the fire, and of course, raised the alarm on the vulnerability of European industry to the Chinese dominance in this regard. The status quo right now, where we're at right now with this, is that while in November these export controls were lifted were suspended actually for at least a year, we have a bit of a breathing space for a year, and the EU has introduced, has acted. So it's introduced the Resource EU initiative that is meant to promote the diversification of supply chains. Procurement of rare earths, and also stockpile rare earths for at least a year. We will know really whether this is going to be effective, and we will actually have managed, to distend a bit, the tensions really fall next year. So in November 2026, when this suspension will be interrupted or will be phased out again. So this means that in theory, controls will be back on. We will know whether the EU will be better placed than this year, or will again, the European industry will be again, under, will be choked and taking away the oxygen given by the rare earths. We will know. Then there is a third, and then in terms of this as well, which is actually very important. It comes even before the spring and fall, is all the conversations around conditioning Chinese investments. I believe that we're going to talk about this a little bit later in these events, but Another key moment to look at is the Industrial Accelerator Act, like next January, mostly because we will know whether the EU will have put in place like measures to condition Chinese investments, and whether and we will know how that will be taken by China. And finally, there is everything related to climate diplomacy. On one hand, we have a clear intention to step up, at least on paper. At least in paper, we have a clear intention to step up joint leadership, to step up, to maintain momentum for climate action on the global level, cooperate deeper with emerging and developing economies. And this was reiterated in the July summit, just like a few months ago. But then at the same time, like if you look at how COP, played out, I mean, COP was anticipated by rather rancorous back and forth between the EU leadership and the Chinese leadership about the lack of ambitiousness or ambition in their respective NDCs. Hoekstra, came out very publicly criticizing China, when at the moment it still didn't have, like a very concrete NDC itself. I mean, the EU still didn't have quite a complete plan. And then, COP, while there were a lot of meetings between the Chinese delegation and the European delegation, they were very, very welcome. At the same time, we saw in the space on the negotiations that over and over and over again, especially the space related to the Just Work Transition Program. The Just Transition Work Program, was dominated by a conversation on unilateral trade measures and attacks on, the EU CBAM and its perceived green protectionist strategy. So in that sense, I would say that, to summarize, there is a lot that is going on. COP clearly will be another moment. COP 31 in Turkey will be another moment, a key moment to watch. And the real test is whether this China and the EU will be able to weather trade tensions without derailing climate diplomacy. I think that climate diplomacy still maintains the status of a safe haven, especially when it relates to more, let's say, technical dialogues. In general, the more technical, the better. But we will know really next year how that is going to play out, especially because also CBAM is going to come in force in January. And therefore, the entire year will be a testing ground for EU-China cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Cecilia. I think you gave us a brilliant overview of the enormous complexity of EU-China dynamics and relations, but also in a way, you also illustrated how for the European side, it's really about managing that interdependence and in many ways also managing vulnerabilities and risks. And I think both of those really play out also externally when we're talking about external investments. We'll park that for now. We'll talk about that perception of risk first. Jesper, I want to ask you, from an EU industry or Danish industry point of view, Chinese clean tech. Denmark is a very strong player in wind, in Power-to-X, in hydrogen, etc. At the same time, it is a nation which has industries that are increasingly also at risk of cheap Chinese imports or even Chinese manufacturing on the European continent. So I'm wondering, how does the Confederation of Danish Industries look at this, and how does your membership, especially those industrial players who are faced with Chinese competition, how are they looking at some of these moments that Cecilia was talking about, for example, the Industrial Accelerator Act, not necessarily going into the specific policies, but really if you could reflect a bit on what the demands or asks are from the Danish industry and the Danish clean tech industry when it comes to managing or framing Chinese investments within Europe.
Thank you. Thanks again for the invitation. It's a complex question. And I would like if there's not some concern among the membership about our membership. And it's not about EU-China, it's the general geopolitical instability we have. I mean, it's the war with Russia, in the Ukraine, it's the conflict there, it's uncertainty about the US policies. I mean, we are just looking into a very, very unstable world. And that, of course, gives problems for for our companies. And that's not just in the clean tech industry, it's in general. So definitely concerns, but also realization of the interdependence that Cecilia just mentioned. So don't take this, what I'm saying, as a wish that we should decouple from China. We should definitely look at other options in some cases, but we also have to realize we are very much interlinked, both in the clean tech and many other ways. And we need to keep a dialogue with China, and we need to keep trading with China. So that's just our overall position. But given that in the clean tech market, where, as you said, we have some strong companies, we have big ambitions here, and we are seeing increased competition, especially out in the Southeast Asia market. In Europe, we are still quite strong, have a quite good market share, but we are seeing Chinese competitors coming in. And we still believe that our companies can remain competitive due to innovation, due to keeping, because it's not only about manufacturing the wind turbine, it's also about all the things that come about it, the support services. It's also about managing the grid. It's also about setting up offshore wind farms, which is a complex task in itself. So it's not that we are saying we cannot compete as such, but there are issues we have to look at, especially when we look at the competition from China. And I will mention 3 things that are main concerns, main issues for us. The bit of unequal competition, I think it was also really mentioned by Cecilia. There's definitely a difference in market access, what's possible in the EU and what's possible in China for Danish companies, at least Danish wind turbine manufacturers. We also have a different set of subsidies, and now we are still looking into what the actual level is of state support from China. But I think you shared an article with me where it says that Chinese companies will get like 4% support in the revenue, while OECD countries within companies within clean tech get maybe 1%. So already there's a difference, and there might be other things coming. So we have definitely a case of unequal competition. Then Cecilia also mentioned the supply chain dependencies. Definitely a concern when China all of a sudden start regulating the access to rare minerals, which is a key component not only in wind turbines, but in many of the clean tech solutions. So there is a need to look at that. How can we diversify it? Can Europe become stronger in that? And then the last issue is our home market. I mean, the European market, even though the wind investments last year set a record, we are facing regulatory burdens. We are facing slow administrative procedures. When we have tenders, it's not always clear what are should you pay for setting up the windmills, or are you receiving subsidies? That's changing. I mean, we had one bid round in Denmark where we tried to get money from setting up the wind turbines as a country, and nobody bid. So we had to change that. So we probably also need to look at those incentive structures. So these are 3 main issues. So what can we do about it? That's the key question, I guess. Starting from the last one, because that's probably the easy one. I mean, we can do a lot on the home market. I mean, there's the Draghi report mentioned a lot of things we could look at in terms of administrative procedures, faster approvals, and that's not just within clean tech, that also go for pharma, innovation. That we definitely have to look at. And during the presidency that Denmark currently holds of the EU, we had an event at the Danish industry a few months ago. I don't know if you heard about it, but it's called the Copenhagen Pledge, where we have gathered 28 of the major companies in Europe. So it's not only Danish companies. I mean, Maersk were there, Novo Nordisk were there, but also Saab, Airbus participated, I think, Siemens. And there we had Macron, Ursula von der Leyen there, and these companies committed that if the EU can implement the recommendations in the Draghi report, if we can work on this. They committed to raising their investment in the EU by 50%. And if that effect goes to the general European company population, we could actually close the 800 billion euro investment gap mentioned in the Draghi report. So the possibilities are there, but we need to act on a European level. I think this needs to be a little bit faster than it is now, right? Because that's also a major problem. On the supply chains, it's a little bit more difficult, I think, but definitely we need to look into incentives for developing some of the technologies that we don't have, processing of rare earth minerals, magnets, batteries. How can we actually help develop that using European funds? Can we guarantee some prices on the European minerals, or if you sell to European countries? I mean, so we are lacking investments of also extraction of rare earth minerals because we are not sure that the market will be there in Europe. So there's definitely something we also can do on that, but it's a little bit more difficult to do. And then the last point on the market access, I just don't have the answer there. I mean, I definitely keep a closer dialogue with China and see what we can do. Can we also use our own muscle somehow to push them a little bit on their access to the European market, which I guess we're already doing with some of the European regulation. But that's a bit of a bigger nut to crack, how we could actually get a more competitive Chinese market for European clean tech solutions as well.
Thank you. I mean, maybe a quick follow-up question, if you allow me. I think a lot of what you're saying is really about keeping ambition, making sure that basically Europe's own decarbonization, clean tech markets, that it stays on track. At the same time, I think what we're all waiting for is clarity on by European, made in Europe, basically the criteria that I think a lot of companies are waiting for as well. So to me, my question is it just about ambition in terms of keeping the targets, making sure that investments are taking place, or is it also to a question of using some of these more defensive tools that exist or that the EU can employ? I mean, how do you look at this from an industry point of view?
Well, we are quite ambivalent on it, definitely from a Danish perspective, because we always believed a lot in free competition. I mean, we are quite small economy, so we are quite dependent on trading with other countries. So we do not recommend a situation, at least, where we go into more protectionism, that we start having a defensive measures and we start having more and more trade barriers. So we have to somehow use the European regulation and not go in that direction. But there are other measures that we're already using. I mean, looking at sustainable supply chains, responsibility in the supply chains, that you can put up some of these recommendations that will actually make it more possible for European companies to compete. I guess CBAM is also an example of that. And I think we have to use those sort of tools, but saying we want free competitions, but we want free competition on an equal level. And Europe is a front runner in making that type of regulation, and we should keep sticking to that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this is also really what's happening right now in Europe, that there's this sort of ambivalence or ambiguity between the competition logic and just the need for some protections. And then the question is how far or how to actually balance that. And I think I want to move to Ceren, because a lot of what we're talking about is also about infrastructure investments, energy infrastructure investments within Europe, but also in Europe's immediate neighborhood, including the MENA region, Turkey, etc. You've been looking at EU or infrastructure investment and Chinese infrastructure investment in those areas. Could you give us, based on your experience and your work, some of the trends that you see, and in your view also how you think Europe should handle or manage the de facto dominance in a lot of the technology being provided by China in those infrastructure projects?
Thank you. Yes, indeed. We have been witnessing very interesting times recent years in European neighborhoods. We have been talking about China taking over Europe's immediate neighborhood in terms of sustainable transitions. For example, the Gulf's post-oil future is said to be delivered by China. Similarly, the North African part of MENA, again, seems like they just handed over their sustainable transition to China. Right. But then when you look at the specific cases, the countries like Turkey and the enlargement countries, Western Balkans, for example, and the Eastern Mediterranean region, the Gulf countries, Egypt, Morocco, when you look at the investment and construction operation structures, the funding structures of all these mega projects are actually much more nuanced and variegated than what we see at a first glance. What is happening there, in my opinion, is that China's connectivity projects and other mega projects like the Belt and Road Initiative or Global Development Initiative is actually able to claim the ownership of these mega transitions, but not necessarily being the sole handler of these transitions. And this is going to be actually my final point about what the EU or Europe should be doing. Just, give the punchline at the beginning. That I think what we should be doing is having these bold claims at public infrastructures in sustainable transitions in our partner countries. Because competing with China, coming up with a standalone alternative project is practically not possible, not because of the lack of technology or funds, but the production networks are so intertwined that even when you look at the Chinese investment in MENA, for example, like half of them have European companies anyways. So theirs are intertwined too. So it is about the message that is delivered that will actually help to pave the way for the European countries. Okay, this is my main message, but let me step back and try to explain how I have come to this conclusion, actually. China's the engagement with China for third countries either happen through an attempt or negotiation to be in the production networks, like the EVs, for example. We have talked about it, right? And different sub-regions of Europe is actually quite active in this race towards being a part of China's EV networks as well, like the CE countries, Southern European countries, and whatnot, and Western Balkans enlargement countries as well. And the other way is China's investments in connectivity, investments like ports, but not only for the transport or the security of supply chains, but also creating new production networks, like the industrial parks attached to these ports are generally designed and built and sometimes operated by China as well, and we see that more in the Eastern Mediterranean, or you guys will know it better than I do, but in Africa too, this industrial port plus park plus ports system is more common in MENA and in Africa as well. And the renewable energies, I think, sit in between these two, the production networks and the industrial parks that serve multiple purposes. So for the renewable energies, the European neighborhood countries engage with China in multiple ways. One is the Chinese investment in the infrastructure, like the big, or now actually increasingly more small, but solar and wind parks, the markets, the equipment and end user markets, and also, again, as I said, sponsoring the macro level transitions, like the post-oil transitions and whatnot. So if you look at the examples, for example, the Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, these are like all post-oil countries, and they look like they are heavily engaged with China. But when we look at it, actually, the most of the funding comes from their own state capital institutions. They are not relying on Chinese funding a lot. And Chinese companies have various role in these transitions, but it really depends on negotiations based on the projects. This is for countries that are relatively more developed, more stable financially and everything. So when we look at other MENA countries like Egypt or Morocco, for example, that also depends on the strength of the industrial policy. Meaning how much the governments try to plan their industrial upgrading in the medium range. And in the case of Morocco, for example, we see a stronger recipient country involvement, and in the Egyptian case, we see a more of an oscillation and a more of a it uses both the AIB funding, but also Silk Road Fund. Silk Road Fund is for the BRI, and AIB is like a more multinational one. And maybe I'm going to conclude with an example of Turkey, which I actually find interesting because we see a story of the European companies in collaboration with other Asian companies, like Korean and Japanese companies, pushing the Chinese companies out of the infrastructure markets. Of course, they have to cede the markets for equipment and end user technologies to China because no one can compete with Chinese products. We also talked about that. But they were actually able to dominate Turkey's solar and wind transition. And they didn't let China to take over the solar and wind investments in Turkey. And I find this interesting because that actually happened before we have started here in Brussels talking about global partnerships. Now we are talking a lot about that, right? Like we have to collaborate with technology middle powers like Korea, Japan, Canada, and whatnot. This de facto collaboration actually happened before that, but I think it sets a good example of how Europe can proceed in the neighboring countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think there's two things I want to pick up on, and then for Cecilia, actually. So you meant this sort of interdependence or intertwined operation between European and Chinese companies is de facto the case in many countries. But at the same time, you also say that made a very clear example of how industrial policies and policy choices of governments in terms of how and who invests and gains ground also matters a lot. And I wanted to, before I go to Kuda, I wanted to ask a quick question to Cecilia based on your work that you've done on what I think is called this pragmatic cooperation, or the need for industrial policy choices to try and reframe Chinese investments also in European industries. I think you called for a conditional approach to Chinese FDI in the automotive industries. Could you perhaps elaborate very briefly what that would look like? And also how you see in the current context, because we're talking a lot about fearful narratives around Chinese investment and Chinese content in or on the European market. How do you see that moving forward, and how acceptable that conditional approach would be? Thank you.
For sure. Actually, thank you very much for the panelists for the very interesting points. Indeed, I did spend some time reflecting on what would be a pragmatic approach to condition investments. When I say pragmatic, means shying away from ideology as much as possible, and starting from this fact that I was saying before. So this economic interdependence, in particular, what it rests on. So let's say the central assumption is that the EU can leverage its market access as its primary bargaining chip, essentially, to extract strategic concessions from Chinese firms. Of course, the moment in which this assumption then stops holding, then of course the entire everything else then should be put in question again. But so far, I trust the single market and the attractiveness of the single market enough to suggest that a strategy should first of all apply differentiated conditions. So it should shy away not only from ideology but also from a one size fits all kind of approach. This is something that I believe in a lot. When I was working at Bruegel, this work that you referred to, I was done in my previous with my previous hat. It was something that also with my team there we argued a lot for. And in the case of Chinese investments, that would mean requiring that there are some sectors that are more more strategic or more sensitive, and some others where instead this is less the case. Of course, then we can argue what is strategic and what is sensitive. I would argue that, for example, solar panels is less strategic, mostly because of, for example, it's not so much because of the technology, but mostly because of the manufacturing activities. They don't take up such a they don't offer such a large employment opportunity, nor there is a huge amount of investment that is flowing in that direction. It's a completely different case when you look, for example, at batteries, and also there, if you look at, for example, at battery cells and module manufacturing, I think that is again more strategic than instead EV assembly. So what do you then mean then? Then once you are able to understand, to differentiate what are like the high strategic, let's say the high priority sectors, and the one that are, let's say, second tier sectors, then what we are arguing was for a high conditionality strategy for example, battery cell and module manufacturing that would require, for example, EU majority joint ventures. I'm sorry, I'm a bit sick. So joint ventures that would allow the control, of European partners, a higher control of European partners on these joint ventures. This you would. You can ask yourself, isn't that already the case? Like if you look at, for example, CATL joint ventures or joint ventures, for example, between CATL and a Hungarian company, isn't that already the case? Not always. Very often you have that the EU has the minority share, which again is not necessarily a bad thing per se, but it becomes a source of a threat to economic security in these highly strategic sectors. And I think that would mandate in this high conditionality strategy would be, the setup, of R&D centers with a minimum of, project budget that is just dedicated to local innovation activities. So not simply setting up the R&D facility mostly for show, but actually, having like money allocated to that and activities that are running in there. Shared IP on manufacturing processes. You cannot really ask IP on core chemistries. Then, the entire incentives for a foreign company to engage in such a joint ventures, then it disappears. But instead of manufacturing processes you can. And by the way, that would also mirror what was, Chinese strategy in China for a long time. Then, in the same side, higher level of, localization, supply chain diversification, data sovereignty. That's something that was also argued a lot for. And so on. So this kind of, high conditionality strategy, we are also saying that would apply not only to some specific sectors, but also to investments of a certain size. So like large investments, for example, a gigafactory of a certain capacity, for example. Then we had also suggested on what would be such a threshold, but there's of course up for debate. And then instead a more moderate conditionality strategy would, for example, allow majority foreign-owned joint ventures, but introduce golden shares for, or at least strong board representations for European counterparts. In the same venue, like minimum threshold for local value-added activities and so on. So essentially, you get the idea. So on one hand, go ballistic for those strategies that are really, really, really meant to be, let's say, the core sectors for European industrialization, and at the same time, instead, go more moderate on all the others. The reason why I was saying that, this rests on the assumption that the single market is strong enough for an attractive factor. It does not. It's because I was not only referring to the consumer market. I didn't only refer to the ability, of Chinese companies then to sell European market. Also, the ability of Chinese companies to have access to European and national public investments. So this would be the case, for example, for of course state aid, but at the national level. But also participation in new EU level funding, like innovation funds, for example, IPCEI projects, and so on. Again, also here you would wonder, but is that recommendable? Is it not? At the national level, that already happens. So you already have that some national member states do grant state aid to Chinese companies without really like common rules, or especially without applying the same kind of safeguards. And in fact, coming to the last part of your question on the public political acceptance of this. So in Brussels, I think we have more and more, let's say, an agreement on the fact that there is the need to condition investments, and this idea of also having a more pragmatic approach does, reason quite well with European partners. It changes a lot instead when you look at national member states. So in fact, we can go around Brussels, preaching how the EU should behave, how member states behave, but really, then it's up to member states to then enforce all these kind of policies. And here, the level of openness to such a strategy changes dramatically. On one hand, we have a country like Hungary that's been the main, the one that has benefited the most from Chinese investments, especially in batteries, that argues for an unconditional approach. So it is not interested in imposing any sort of condition, mostly because it fears that then investments would fade away. On the other hand of the spectrum, we have a country like Spain, for example, or France as well, that instead have a way more, let's say, on one hand, they would argue, for example, Spain was the one that abstained from the vote on the tariffs on EVs. So it didn't vote against, but it neither voted in favor of it. It does, court very actively Chinese investments, and it did, so on and so forth. And it frames Chinese investments as a source of, let's say, European reindustrialization opportunity rather than a source of deindustrialization threat. But it's not even, but Spain is not, wide-eyed, or is not naive either, from the threats that can come from these Chinese investments. And Friis is quite, in favor of more conditions. Same case in France, quite open to Chinese investments, but also arguing for, for a long time, also has been arguing for, let's say, stricter control on foreign direct investments, both inbound and outbound. It has a policy in place, the bonus écologique, that does in a way it simply awards support for cars, for example, that are produced in a low carbon way, essentially that are produced, let's say, more closer to its end market. That is meant in a way to discourage the expansion of the higher presence of Chinese vehicles in French market, but it does not exclude Chinese vehicles made in France. So it is on the other hand of the spectrum. And then in between, instead we have a country like Germany that it is both very much in favor of Chinese investments and and at the same time extremely fearful. Why? Because of the economic interdependence I was saying before. It's probably the country whose industry depends the most, in particular automotive industry depends the most on the Chinese market and the Chinese investment. So while it is, let's say, threatened by Chinese competition, it's also very fearful that any sort of condition being imposed on Chinese investment would then end up in a retaliatory measure by the Chinese government. So to be seen. I think that the first test is.
May I ask you to maybe round
I'm
round
done.
up?
I'm finished. I think the first step of this will be really in January, as soon as we will have, as you were saying before, clarity on what is going to happen with the Industrial Accelerator Act. I think then that we will know more.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much. And sorry to interrupt you, because I think what you were saying is absolutely crucial, and it also shows how incredibly complex the picture is. But I think also how Europe is really approaching Chinese investments in a way from a position of weakness. And I want to turn to Kuda on this, and also move the discussion a bit towards this external investment component. So when you hear these conversations about European weakness, things that are around conditionalities on Chinese investments, etc., do you see parallels, or do you see a way this also being reflected in the way European and Chinese investors are seen from an African point of view? Do you see some of these tensions coming up as well? Kuda?
Yeah, hi Alfonso. Just to check that you can hear me before I go
ahead. We can hear and see you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, that's great. So yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. It would have been great to be there, but alas, at least we have internet to at least share our ideas. So I think how I can best answer this question, Alfonso, I think is maybe focusing on what China is doing right, in quotation marks, when it comes to their relationship with Africa, and then show what counter that Europe can provide under the realistic realization that to try tackle China where they are now strong on the continent will just not work, at least from my thinking. So let's start off with, I think, how we understand Chinese investment. In terms of actual technology on the continent, I always push back to say China is not investing with adequate technology on the African continent. At best, it's processing technology for the mining process, but nothing like end user or end technology. So, for example, your solar wafers or your turbines, that's not China's game. Their focus has really been on, as in the best way to put it, securing those supply chains. And if you look at the specific countries on the continent, I always remind people, when it comes to minerals, not all African countries have these minerals. The ones that do have them, it's about 10 to 12 countries. And of those countries, 10 to 12, China has very, very high political relationships with them. And that's something I think Europe has not really caught up to in terms of how important the politics is beyond the economics or the energy decarbonization. In a lot of these countries, of course, there's the long-standing 50-year history fighting against colonialism. But even beyond that, we saw a very weird situation this last 6 months, or let me say 1 year, where we had the China-Africa Forum, and then about a month ago, we had the EU-Africa Summit. And you can see a parallel in terms of diplomatic focus that's given to these summits from the African countries. There's a huge focus on the China-Africa Summit compared to the EU-Africa Summit. That's because there's this very strong belief that they are at least getting quantitative investments from China. And that's because the Chinese state is directing the investments. I think Europe in a lot of ways have been hoping the private sector would lead investments, but the reality is private sector only invest where they know there's a certain state of return on investment. And I don't think Africa is at that state, or any nascent industry. I think industrial policy will show you that, generally speaking, if you go into investment focusing on profit, you won't get as much investment in that space. And I think that's what China has done quite a lot on. That said, we are seeing some pushback from African countries against China's lack of investment on the value chain. So we are seeing some raw material bans. Namibia, Zimbabwe, Zambia, DRC, now South Africa are all speaking about this. And that's indicative that Africa is actually now trying to strengthen their voice on this issue. And if you look at G20, which I think was an interesting confluence of where the conversation is, it was hosted on the African continent for the first time. China took the lead in ensuring that there was an initiative on minerals that was launched there to try basically buttress some of the pressure that they're getting from these African countries to say that we're not getting enough. In contrast, what did Europe do? I think that's a good segue. Europe is still focusing on their traditional partners. So be it the MENA region, which they're quite strong in. There's also South Africa, where they launched the Clean Trade and Investment Partnership, which is all fair and fine. I'm not really against that. But just to say that Europe has not restructured their political relationships, industrial relationships with Africa as much as they should. Even with the global gateway, because it's led by private sector, is not influencing the amount of impact that I think Europe is hoping, at least in terms of that. So if you look, for example, at what I think Europe can really do in terms of what's their leverage, or what can they bring on board. I hope, and I'm willing to be corrected, there's a very strong assumption on the African continent that the European state does not invest in Africa as much as it could. I know there's strong arguments on the European continent that there's just no state funding. But African countries are saying that if China's state can at least give us something, what is Europe doing in terms of their own state-led development, which can actually provide some tangible, realistic, and expected financing over the long term. So I think that's an important thing. But I don't think it should be country-to-country focused as they're doing with South Africa. I think what the European Union can really do with Africa is to strengthen the more regional outlook in terms of a lot of these value additions, because of Europe's own history in terms of how to design trade policies that are beyond one singular country. Europe, I think, need to invest a lot more in terms of how they support the African Union, or to be more specific, the Southern Africa Development Community, in terms of developing those things. We are seeing that with the Lobito Corridor, but the reality is Lobito Corridor is seen as more of as a gateway for the minerals to leave the continent. What would it look like, for example, if EU invested in the North-South Corridor, which was a corridor established this year by the Southern African countries for their minerals? So there's this space that China is not willing to get involved in, and Europe already has quite a lot of influence in, and that could be a potential. And I think my conclusion will be on what was mentioned earlier, which is CBAM. We know that CBAM is coming into enforcement in January. We are being told that there's a review report coming out in the next week or so. Fingers crossed that they actually show that China and Mozambique are not the same when it comes to CBAM. And I think politically, that's a good indication if they can show that countries on the African continent, such as Mozambique, Morocco, South Africa, that are going to be adversely impacted by CBAM, get some form of preferential treatment compared to India and China. And I think in that way, they will start showing how they're actually differentiating and trying to increase their own influence politically and economically on the African continent. But that's definitely a wait-and-see approach. I'll stop there for now, Alfonso. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kuda. I think you made a very clear point around the political and industrial relationship and basically the diplomacy side from the European Union. I want to bounce that question to Jesper. Do you recognize that assessment of EU basically not managing to own the political relationship with African countries and sort of build this really strong set of industrial partnerships? Because I think that's where the private sector or European private sector also comes in. I think partially there's been lots of expectations on Global Gateway from the private sector side to actually offer that and to create that kind of dynamic. So do you recognize this, and how do you see your membership's demands and asks in terms of how the EU positions itself towards African countries on these issues?
Well, I definitely agree that historically I think we have the political relations with Africa to start with, but we haven't been able to link that to the economic relations. And that has been, that leads to maybe where we are now, that we are not able to show that value we can give in terms of trade and economic development of the countries, despite of the aid that European countries have been giving for a long time. And I think the infrastructure investments are a good example of this. I mean, when you travel in African countries, which I do a lot, it's quite visible what China is doing, right? You see a lot of roads, you see a lot of ports. It's not so visible what the EU is doing or the European countries are doing. And so that's one thing where I agree. We can maybe not compete with the Chinese on that, but we need to be much more visible in the terms of the investments we are doing, and actually get some investments for Global Gateway, get some actual state investments there, and use the European companies and what we can do in the strongholds we have. I mean, port management, investing in ports. We've done a little bit in Kenya, but it's not that visible. Again, that is the EU that has been doing that. everybody knows China built the road from Nairobi, right? So that's much more visible. Energy investments, of course. I mean, why not wind turbines? In Africa, we've done a little bit in Kenya from Danish side, but it's not in the Lake Turkana project. But again, it's not that visible from the average citizen that you have wind turbines up there. Water management, we also have big strongholds from European companies there. I mean, why not try and direct some investments there? And again, I think we should be more honest about it and say we want European companies then to be the suppliers. So that part on the political part. But then I just want to, if there's time.
Yes. Yeah. We're going to have to start speeding it up a little bit.
All right. Very briefly, I think we also should recognize the private sector in these the African countries, because we're focusing a lot on the political relationships. But I think what Europe can offer compared to China is that we're actually also looking at more local economic development than just moving out the minerals, as Kudo was talking about. We are working more with the investments and development of value chains. I was in Tanzania a few weeks ago and met with the European delegation there. There's big programs coming up to actually develop the local value chains and linking them more to the European market. And the European market is, again, something we can provide of value, the place where they can actually move some of the products. And that's where I see the difference when I talk to a lot of African companies. They might see Chinese companies more as competitors because they are producing some of the same things, and China is not an easy market to enter. So they're not looking as much to put their products there, where Europe is still very much seen as a place they want to export to, and where we hopefully can leverage that we have the size of this market and maybe some of the more development aid we're still giving to the countries.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to go back to you, Ceren, specifically on this question around European companies. I think we've all talked about greater coherence and EU external investment in Africa needs to be better framed and accelerated. But I think there's lots of pressure also to maximize as much as possible the amount of basically European content that is used in these external investments, as well as European companies' involvement in African the African Global Gateway project. So to me, my question is, like, how do you see this, and how far should we go as a European Union in that really offensive, competitive logic, and what should be the tools or the architecture to do so?
I'm not sure if it is offensive and competitive logic, but if we actually, and I think we all agree, all the panelists, that we need like an industrial policy for the EU, right? Basically, like a more coherent approach and a way to minimize the differences across member states and businesses in the member states. So what I have in mind for Global Gateway is a more coherent agenda, spelled out more clearly in the flagship projects. Even like from the first round of flagship projects to the second one, we actually see a trend towards that, right? Like the first one was like a hodgepodge of like whatever member states sneaked into the list, into the final cut kind of a list, whereas the second one has like this really twin transition undertones, digital and green undertones. So I think that is the way to go, like this, having this like loud and clear image, like we are here to provide you with the public infrastructure for twin transitions, or whatever the EU deems important. But obviously, this is what we're talking about. And the European, once these messages are there, then to mobilize the European companies for the flagship projects geared towards these goals, I think wouldn't be in your face kind of a competition with China. It will be a part of this like broader, greater narrative of the EU. So again, there will be competition, but it will not perceived as a direct competition. And there's always room for negotiation with individual countries, individual projects, with China, with the partners in Africa and everything. So I think it is possible to create a room for European companies in Africa or global gateway destinations without making it about a head-to-head competition. Yeah.
Thank you. And I want to take that question back to you, Kuda, on sort of room for head-to-head competition or not. I think you've worked quite a lot on industries, mineral extraction in southern African countries. There, we do see that the weight of Chinese companies is quite significant. So my question is how do you balance that with then sort of European interests floating around? And also, how do you balance the weight of Chinese investments in some of these key industries that you're working on with the need to maximize opportunities for decarbonization, also for low carbon industrialization? Not to contrast the two, but to try and see how we can find ways for European investments also to better target industries and specific sectors within the Southern African region. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Alfonso. And I think there are about two levels for this question. First of all, there's energy poverty on the continent industrially. We just do not produce enough energy. So basically, that's a really good point of confluence for, I think, European investment, especially for wind and solar energy, where there's a lot of experience. Just like, for example, in Denmark, we've seen quite a lot of work that's been done in the Western Cape in South Africa and Western Namibia, where there's quite a lot of good wind energy there. The idea being decarbonizing some of the already heavily industrial space countries. So, for example, there's not a lot of them, but for example, South Africa, who have quite a big steel plant with ArcelorMittal, they are struggling how to essentially decarbonize this process. Same is also happening, for example, in some value chains, such as chrome, where it's still very much based on coal production. But Glencore is looking for investment for renewable energy to supply some of those mines. So there's some pockets where we have to see the value chain in its totality. So not just the mineral in itself, but prior to that. And I think the energy space is really important to try basically use the economics of renewable energy, which are the best on the continent. But until this day, only 2% of renewable energy is going on the continent. And I think that's because there's a focus on trying to get return on investment from the energy in itself, if we understand what I'm saying, to commodify the energy rather than trying to focus on how to use energy as an enabler for the value chain to actually be broadened. And I think in terms of what China's role then becomes, so for example, the steel industry that I'm quite heavily involved in, China is setting up the biggest steel plant in sub-Saharan Africa in Zimbabwe. The reason why the Zimbabwe government were willing to do this was because ArcelorMittal was pushing against CBAM, saying that we are then going to close. So China saw this as an opportunity to basically say that if ArcelorMittal do decide to close the biggest steel plant in Southern Africa, we'll then take advantage of that situation. But again, that brings back to the point I made around CBAM to say that as someone who really wants to see effective decarbonization policies, CBAM is a great opportunity for that. But the way it is designed does not provide enough differentiation between countries. So if we do get to a point where we're understanding that the situation in Southern Africa is very different to Western China, we will then see better policies, first of all, but I also think more targeted investment where we will see broader participation on the continent, not just from China, but also from Europe. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kuda. I want to open for a few questions from the audience. So I can see you in the room. I can't see anybody online, so I'm relying on Jonathan to help me out with that. So if we've heard a lot, but I think we covered a lot of ground, both on China, Europe, and African dynamics. So please, if you have a specific question, also if you want to direct it to one of the panelists, please do so. All right. I think you are first. Perhaps
Thank you. My name is Lars Grønvold from impact. Thanks for this very interesting discussion on the linkages or the relation China, EU, and investment. One thing that in some way have structured this whole debate has been some per sector, per company, and investments, but not so much about some structural imbalances at macro level, which I also think in some way that shapes this discussion. An economist like Michael Pettis has constantly put that forward, that the massive trade surplus that China has, which has now this year reached 1 trillion. This is things that has to be converted into international assets. That means stocks, bonds, and foreign investments. And that means it creates an environment where China simply has and will have to invest because they so much funds every year by partly suppressing the domestic consumption. And I feel we are discussing it a little bit. Can be fiddled, not to, of course, I think the Draghi report and the recommendation are of course crucial for Europe, but this is a question of enhancing productivity, not so much with the trade balance, etc. But we are sitting in an environment that is in some way stacked against that. I think it's obviously for investment in Africa, it might be very positive that China has all these excess funds they have to invest, but the idea to compete in this year is in some way stacked. I'm a little bit interested in how ECDPM have looked into that we don't only have a discussions sector by sector, industry by industry. So how we look at these structural imbalances without knowing how to actually unwind them, because this, I think, China have told the last 10 years, they said, we know our model is unsustainable. We want to unwind these surpluses, but in principle, it has only gone up and up and up. So there are also very strong structural forces at play in China.
Thank you. I think next is Carlene here at the front.
Did you pass?
Sorry. And then I saw Purva.
Thank you. My name is Carlene Nawa. I'm with Climate Action Platform Africa. Kuda, thank you so much for bringing the Chinese diplomatic relationships and with African countries to the fore. And I was quite intrigued by Jesper's response around Europe's diplomatic relationships as well. One thing that I think I'm observing with many African countries, and I'd love both of your perspectives on that, is that by most African countries, China is perceived to be much less of a judgmental friend. There are less judgments on Africa's politics and less strings attached to the collaboration. It is more transactional. It feels more equal. And that is welcomed by African countries. I would love both of your perspectives on that. When you were saying, yes, but we also have strong relationships, Kuda, what's your reflection on that and how are you seeing some of these perception issues on the African side?
Thank you, Carlene. In the meantime, do we have questions online? Okay.
Thanks. Maybe I have two questions. My name is Purva. I work at ECDPM. The first one is perhaps a bit more practical. I mean, I liked your point about infrastructure almost being production networks. And related to that, one thing that we've come across is that Chinese contractors that work in African countries are highly, highly versatile. So it's never about only building a mine. It's also about building a road that connects to the mine. It's also about providing energy so that you can mine better. And so the question is, this just becomes, it's about securing the supply chain, but also from an African country perspective, where you have very limited capacity, administrative capacity, this just becomes a very attractive offer compared to, say, what's happening on the European side, where you might have 3 different projects that you then have to coordinate among. So one question, not specifically to you, anyone on the panel who can answer this, is to what extent are European actors then acting together so that we come with one offer that is hard to deny for any African country? So that is one point. Second question is more about, Cecilia also mentioned prioritization when it comes to industrial policy in Europe. And I think it's the same kind of thinking also on the African side. And on the European side, in order to achieve some of the ambitions of these industrial policies, they need to have partners. And so there also needs to be some prioritization there, because you can't do everything all at once everywhere. So then the question is, to what extent do we see from the European Commission also this kind of prioritization when Europe works with partners? Because these partners they will need in order to achieve European industrial ambitions. Is there a classification, just the way Cecilia mentioned, that these are specific sectors, or if not sectors, specific areas, specific countries, where we really take this issue of Europe being visible very, very seriously, and in others, we are more open to working together with China or some such? Do we see some kind of prioritization coming out when it comes to partners? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Purva. Johnny? No, I think we have space for one more question.
Thanks for the panelists and the moderator. Sorry, I ran a bit late. So this is Anchi from the European Climate Foundation. I have one question, because we talk a lot about the competition dynamics between China, Europe, and Africa. So I'm just wondering whether the panelists, experts say there's also a pathway for China-EU cooperation in Africa. So I give an example, like what other audience also mentioned, the versatility of Chinese EPC, the construction companies. So these companies actually, they are also very fervently seeking public financing, especially from European partners. So we see there's a potential cases where the Chinese EPC companies working with financing provided by European institution and also maybe from other MDBs. And then the African state sovereign, they could provide some equity capital. So in this way, there could be a trilateral cooperation and each party gets its unfair share. The same is also related to what the first audience question, because Chinese very large trade imbalance, actually it makes a very difficult situation for this SOE financing system to continue provide a similar amount as before. So what we observe is that there are many Chinese companies, they are very eager to work with European financial institutions, but they don't necessarily know the way, and also the current kind of political sentiment is more geared towards competition, which they just don't find very helpful. And so there's also all the more public affair, international relations affair, it's always trying to frame a more competition dynamic, whereas actually the companies in the real economy, they say there's a genuine opportunity for collaborate. So I'm just wondering what's the panelist take on this. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we'll start with the panelists online. Perhaps I won't direct the questions to you, but I could suggest that Cecilia, perhaps you want to take on the structural imbalance point, and Kuda, there's a couple that were directly put to you as well. But perhaps Cecilia, do you want to start?
For sure. And I agree very much. That especially everything I touched on was more, let's say, micro economy, let's say, level kind of conditionality, right? But then the problems that we face and that the European policymakers try to answer, they start from macroeconomic issues. So the structural imbalance, right? So in a sense, to just build on what the latest, question, was addressing, was the fact that China's, weak household consumption and at the same time very high savings means that China must export a lot to just keep factories running, essentially. And then you can see that a lot, especially in some sectors. For example, in the case of solar panels, that was very much the case. You had several companies that export a lot on foreign markets. But it's also the case for electric vehicles, really. Just because the market, the domestic market is too narrow, it's too strict of a space for all of the OEMs that are present in China. So this means that there is a condition for permanent overcapacity in such sectors. At the same time, this creates two problems for us, clearly. So for foreign markets, like European markets, that are risk being overflooded by cheap Chinese products, but also means that China cannot really shift away from an investment-driven model that is no longer sustainable to a consumption-led model. And as was just remarked in the audience, this is something that China would like. China would like to move to, to spur domestic consumption more and use that as a lever for growth. And there is room for cooperation in that. The question that I have is, to what extent can this, come only from the EU? So I was talking about, EU level strategies. The only thing that I can see that EU policymakers can really do unilaterally is to impose, for example, counter-cyclical tariffs, for example, or tie, FDI investments, Chinese FDIs in Europe to a ceiling, for example, on how many, clean tech projects, how many firms can come to Europe, to just reduce the flow of Chinese overreach in Europe. But more than that, would just be stepping over the sovereignty of the Chinese government. So I think that this is an era for it's an era for deeper dialogue and cooperation that be really, really wanted by both parties. The problem is, to what extent can you something that works at the technical level does not necessarily bode well for how the political situation is. So the question is, to what extent is there a political willingness for such a dialogue? And then I will just touch very briefly on Purva questions on to what extent can we see prioritization of partnerships at EU level. I mean, to an extent, I think that there is such a willingness. So the clean trade and investment partnerships are there to exactly do this, to prioritize some particular sectors and particular countries. So I think that in the ambition of the EU, it's there to do such a thing. Then we can argue whether or not that is a tool that is fit for purpose. But I would say that there is an intention. I think there are people in the audience from INPA that are better placed to answer such a question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kuda, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Alfonso. I think I'll be quick, and I think I'll answer the first one around this perception that China is less judgmental. And I think that's the wrong way of looking at this. I think we have a state lens when we think about this, and that's not actually what's happening on the ground. So, for example, in Southern Africa, where a lot of the 75% of the critical minerals on the continent are, there's what's called the former liberation movements of Southern Africa. These are the parties that led to independence in a lot of these countries. They are still the ones who are in power for a lot of these countries. Who was the main support? It was China. So it's not necessarily that China is less judgmental. I think it's more of China has a deeper relationship with those who are currently in control of those African states. And that's where I think there's a bit more nuance that is needed. This is, of course, then is favored with the idea that a lot of our African countries are not democratic, neither do they have plans of being democratic. If anything, they want to stay being stabilized authoritarian regimes. They look up to China as a system of running a country and an economy as something that they want. So I think that's what's happening here, more than China being less judgmental. And I think you can even see that for countries that are more democratic, Europe usually has more and better relationships in terms of industrial relationships. And then around the issue of cooperation, that was asked by another colleague. I think South Africa is a very interesting space in terms of where we can see some European-China cooperation. China, of course, then uses their focus around infrastructure development and prioritizing things like how to build out transmission lines. They're getting quite a lot of investment in that. Europe is doing a lot more of the financial investments, henceforth, with CEPS. So we do see that. And I think what's interesting in South Africa is they're reworking their transmission system policies to basically allow for more private sector development. And you are seeing European investments and Chinese investments playing in that space, but focusing on their competitive advantages. But I think the most important actor here is actually not Europe or China. It's actually the African economic actors. And I think that's something we should also think about that are involved in industrial space. So, for example, artisanal miners are a huge part of a lot of these supply chains that are not really focused on or mentioned. China's got a lot of relationships with Chinese middlemen, being on the ground, getting a lot of these minerals and then ending up exporting them to China. So that act, I think, needs a lot more of a focus and an understanding to see the economic actors on the continent that are not political, but are primarily economic. How are they being involved in terms of cooperation with European partners or Chinese partners? Thanks.
Thank you so much. Jesper, over to you.
I think I need this. I agree with Kuda that I think it's more about the relations into the government, that it has been more transactional. And it gets a little bit connected with your question around coherence, that we have not been very good from European side at saying, if we do this investment, we'll use some of the aid money going in to support a road or a port, or, transmission lines are an obvious example that we could go in and do, saying, okay, we have private investors coming into the energy market, we'll support then some of the infrastructure around it so you can actually use it and benefit from it. And we have not been very good at that. And I think we should do much more of that. Very small example I have is a Danish company doing a banana farm in Kenya, and they can't even get the local government to fund the road, and they can't get the Danish government to fund it either, to just get the products out of there. And that's something you could actually go in and do for very, very low cost. So definitely something around that, about the values. And again, I agree. We have a lot of countries who are not democratic and are annoyed that Europe keeps saying that we have to become democratic, you have to lead the way. I have, and now maybe it's more my personal opinion, my personal impression, I have a hard time seeing us letting that go, not mentioning it. First of all, there is to see when we become very hypocritical if we only talk about this with the democratic countries and not with the other countries. And then we also have to be careful. There are some movements in Africa at the moment, or in some African countries, with protests against the way they're currently run. And maybe if that actually leads to changes in some countries, maybe we are better positioned, and we'll be happy that we were a little bit judgmental at the time.
Thank you. Ceren, you have the last word. There was this one question on integration and sort of cooperation between European actors, and really looking at this as from a value chain or ecosystems point of view. So perhaps you want to take that up as well.
Sure. I'm going to start with the info question about Chinese overcapacity, because I was a China watcher in my previous life, and I'm still watching China very carefully. So I actually beg to differ on this. Permanency of overcapacity in China is obviously structural, but they're also aware of it. And if you look at the upcoming 5-year plan, they're actually coming up with some measures to solve or at least curb these structural issues. So we might see changes in the future. So I think it makes sense for now to look at it sectorally. Like we saw that happening in solar and wind. We are experiencing it in EVs, and I dare say we're going to see it in biotech as well. Like biotech is already done, overcapacity is happening there. But maybe after that, there might be changes. So let's continue watching China closely on this. I'm going to move on to the next set of questions from our ECDPM colleague. But I'm going to make the same point about looking at things sectorally. At least in the medium run, because so the question was two questions. One is how can we have one European offer, like a national industrial policy for the EU, and other is how can we do it with the partners. So at this point, it looks next to impossible to me to have one offer for the entire Europe if we see it in the macro perspective, structurally in all aspects of the global economy. But if you look at sectorally, even within a sector, specific technological development or the provision of some services, public goods, public infrastructure, then we might be able to actually get all the member states together and the businesses, private sector together for these sectoral specific issues. And same for the partners. When we look at sectorally, specifically about specific technologies, infrastructures, then we can develop this idea of global partnerships, because as of now, it is more on the visual thinking stage, more on the digital, to be fair. We have partnerships, dialogues, alliances, and everything. But in the clean industrial deal, partnerships 2 lines, not even a paragraph. So maybe we can, substantiate these partnerships through sectoral things. And one last word about the narratives. So I have been thinking in this panel actually, because I'm trying to make this case for a European narrative through Global Gateway, right, in Africa. But then you guys all talk about CBAM, right? And CBAM is perceived so negatively in the global south because it comes across as so condescending and so imposing and everything. So just like a warning, I think that's a warning tale about how we shouldn't go about these grand narratives. Just I want to give a very small example that the enlargement countries are actually modeling their ETSs after China, not Europe, because China, there are two Chinas, right? One China is this super developed and taking over the world China, but there's also a developing China, the Western Central China, and their ETS system is actually geared towards protecting their SMEs in the lesser developed parts of China. And our own enlargement countries are actually modeling their ETSs after that because to protect themselves from CBAM, let alone other partner countries. So yeah, I'm going to just stop with this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would love to get into a discussion on CBAM, as some of you know, but Mariela, I'm sure, will not allow it. I won't summarize because that comes at the end of the full workshop. I'll just say that to me, I've learned a lot from all of you, and I think it's really clear also how any conversation about European or Chinese investments in clean tech in African countries or in industries in African countries cannot be delinked from internal European dynamics and European industrial policies or economic developments in mainland China as well, which I think you made very, very clear, Ceren. And so this is the kind of conversation that we want to have moving forward, a much more nuanced conversation about how Europe acts abroad, based on or linked to how it acts at home. And similarly, in a global space, want to have that nuanced conversation about how China, as well as other major industrial players, how they act and how that is also linked to their own internal developments. So thank you very much. Thank you so much for your time, all four of you. And I will yield the microphone back to Mariela.